As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
America has always been proud of its military might. Hundreds of billions of dollars were spent annually on developing the latest weapons systems. The American defense industry was considered a symbol of strength, a guarantor of global security, and Washington's main tool for influencing its allies. But recent years have called this indisputable truth into question. There are increasing accusations that it was Donald Trump's policies that dealt a blow to the U.S. defense industry, and the consequences of this blow are proving to be much deeper than initially thought.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
While Washington continued to talk about leadership, European capitals were making a different decision. France, Germany, Italy, and other countries began investing billions in their own weapons projects, gradually abandoning American contracts. Even Canada, the closest ally and neighbor of the US, began to reconsider its dependence on American technology. What happened? Why are partners who have been buying American weapons for decades now looking for alternatives?
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The answer lies not only in economics but also in politics. From the very beginning of his presidency, Donald Trump has relied on tough protectionism, trade wars, and withdrawal from international agreements. These steps have destroyed the usual balance. Allies have lost trust in the United States, and the defense industry itself is in a state of deep crisis. Aging technology, a shortage of specialists, rising costs, and supply disruptions have become the norm. Today, we are seeing a picture that was difficult to even imagine 10 years ago. Contracts worth billions of dollars are passing American companies by. Europe is creating its own fighter jets, its own air defense systems, its own tanks and ships. Canada is strengthening its cooperation with European and Asian manufacturers. And the US is facing the fact that its products are no longer a symbol of reliability.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
The question that concerns experts around the world is, can lost trust be restored? Or has the era of American monopoly in the arms industry come to an end? After all, if the trend continues, it will not only be about the economy and jobs. At stake is U.S. global leadership and the very perception of Washington as a center of power. In this video, we will examine how Donald Trump's decisions became the starting point for the crisis in the American defense industry. We will explain why Europe and Canada are turning down contracts and what consequences this has for global politics. Prepare to hear facts that are rarely reported in the open press, but which change our understanding of the future world order. For decades, America built its power on the military industry. Since the beginning of the Cold War, arms production has been at the heart of the American economy, a technological driving force and a symbol of power. Arms exports provided jobs for hundreds of thousands of citizens, strengthened alliances, and allowed Washington to dictate terms on the world stage. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the US held more than a third of the global arms market, making it the absolute leader in this field. Against the backdrop of such dominance, the defense industry seemed unshakable, and any fluctuations were perceived as only temporary difficulties. But in recent years, the picture has changed radically. Analysts are increasingly saying that Donald Trump's policies have not only challenged the established system, but also struck at its very foundations.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
When Trump came to power, he bet on the slogan "America First." It sounded impressive, but behind the beautiful rhetoric, lay a sharp tightening of the rules of the game. He started trade wars with China, revised the terms of cooperation with the European Union, and sharply criticized NATO and its allies, accusing them of sponging off American taxpayers. All this undermined confidence in the US as a reliable partner. But what was even more serious was that his decisions began to affect the defense industry itself within the country. Military contracts, which had been distributed among the largest corporations for years, were put on hold. The modernization programs, in particular the renewal of the fleet and missile defense systems, were frozen or cut back. According to official Pentagon data, several dozen key projects were postponed for at least 5 years. But behind the scenes, the situation looked even more alarming. Information leaked to the media that some suppliers were simply leaving the market due to a lack of stable orders. Factories in Alabama, Texas, and Virginia were cutting back on production. Thousands of people were being laid off, and skilled engineers were leaving for private IT companies, where they were offered more stable conditions and higher salaries. The American defense industry's dependence on supplies of rare earth metals and electronic components from Asia caused particular tension. Under Trump, this problem became acute. Trade barriers made purchases more expensive and unstable. Experts noted in confidential reports that the production of certain types of missiles and aviation systems was at risk of disruption due to a simple shortage of parts. For the first time in many decades, Washington faced the threat of being unable to fulfill export contracts on time. This was a blow to its reputation, and in the arms business, reputation is just as important as the technology itself.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Europe watched closely. Whereas EU countries had previously viewed American weapons as the only option, they now began to look for alternatives. France and Germany launched a program to create a new generation of fighter jets. Italy and Spain invested in joint projects to produce armored vehicles. These initiatives were no secret, but it was during Trump's presidency that they gained momentum. The Allies lost faith in the reliability of the US as a long-term partner and decided to develop their own independence. Political unpredictability was no less important. Donald Trump repeatedly stated that the US could reduce its participation in NATO if European countries did not increase their defense spending. For Brussels, this sounded like an ultimatum. Behind the scenes, European officials said that Washington no longer guarantees security, which means that relying solely on American supplies is a risk. According to several think tanks, in the first 2 years of Trump's presidency alone, the share of American weapons in new NATO contracts fell by almost 15%. One particularly high-profile case involved a Scandinavian country canceling a large order for American fighter jets in favor of a European project. Officially, the decision was based on technical specifications and cost, but sources claimed that the real reason was Trump's policies. Allies feared that the US could revise the terms or even cancel deliveries at any moment. It is in this combination, economic pressure, trade wars, personnel crisis, and political instability, that many experts see the beginning of a systemic undermining of the American defense industry. By 2020, the situation had become so serious that even within Congress, warnings were being sounded that the country risked losing its leading position in the global arms market. But in the White House, these signals were often ignored. Trump continued to insist on his course, claiming that he was protecting American interests. As a result, we see a paradoxical picture. The policy, declared as protection for domestic manufacturers, turned into problems for the manufacturers themselves. Protectionism and abrupt diplomatic moves alienated allies, froze major programs, increased dependence on unstable suppliers, and accelerated the departure of specialists from the industry. Europe and Canada, traditionally closely linked to the US, began to move away, developing their own projects and reducing purchases from Washington.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
This trend did not immediately become a complete disaster, but it was under Donald Trump that the foundations for the crisis were laid. Today, as analysts take stock, they note that the US defense industry has lost not only some of its contracts, but also its most important resource, the trust of its allies. And regaining that trust will be much more difficult than compensating for financial losses. The crisis in the American defense industry, which began with political decisions and trade wars, has been particularly acute within the country, where until recently there was confidence in stable orders and endless growth. Alarm bells are now increasingly sounding about problems in personnel, technology, and the very logic of production. Hundreds of factories linked to defense contracts found themselves on the brink of survival. Large corporations were still able to balance their books thanks to old contracts and international connections, but dozens of small and medium-sized enterprises involved in supply chains began to close down. As a result, the defense industry, which had always been considered the pride of America, gradually began to lose its internal potential. One of the key problems was a shortage of personnel. According to the Aerospace Industries Association, the average age of engineers in the sector exceeded 50 years. Young people were not rushing to join the defense industry, preferring to work in IT, robotics, or civilian startups. This was partly due to the industry's image. High-profile scandals involving corruption, bureaucracy, and inflated contract prices made the sector less attractive. But another factor proved to be more important: a decline in orders and constant instability due to political decisions made careers in the defense industry unpredictable. As a result, thousands of qualified specialists left factories and design bureaus for private companies, and their places were often filled by less experienced personnel.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Technological stagnation was no less alarming. A number of programs launched in the early 2000s had still not been fully completed by the end of the second decade of the 21st century. New fighter jets, missile defense systems, and promising tanks existed as prototypes, but never made it to mass production. The reasons varied from lack of funding to technical failures, but the main one was that many developments were based on old platforms. Where Europe focused on bringing together research centers and flexibly using private technologies, the US got stuck in endless negotiations between corporations and the Pentagon. The situation got crazy. Some projects that cost billions of dollars ended up being outdated before they even hit the market 10 years later. Added to this was logistical vulnerability. In recent years, it has become known that a significant portion of the electronic components for American weapons were purchased abroad, including in Asia. And while this used to seem like a routine process of global trade, after the introduction of new tariffs and sanctions, deliveries began to fail. Some factories were left without critical parts for weeks, and sometimes months. As a result, contract deadlines were pushed back and costs rose. Several large orders related to the production of missile systems had to be revised and even reduced. This not only dealt a blow to the economy, but also undermined the confidence of foreign buyers who expected stability and speed.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico, based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Against the backdrop of these problems, Europe took a decisive step. EU countries, which had long considered American supplies to be the only guarantee of security, began to actively develop their own arms programs. Germany and France invested billions in a joint fighter jet project to replace old platforms. Italy and Spain strengthened their cooperation in the field of armored vehicles and missile systems. An important point was that these projects were supported at the EU level, which gave them political and economic stability. American corporations tried to hold on to the market by offering discounts and promising to improve conditions. But the Allies increasingly talked about something else: reliability. They saw that the US, due to internal crises and political decisions, could not guarantee the timely fulfillment of contract. Moreover, they feared that in the event of a new wave of trade wars, deliveries would simply be disrupted. As a result, Europe chose the path of independence. According to a number of analytical agencies, in just 3 years, the volume of orders that traditionally went to the US fell by almost 20% in favor of European manufacturers. The reaction of Eastern European countries was particularly significant. These states, accustomed to relying on American support for security issues, unexpectedly began to diversify their purchases. Some of the contracts went to German and French companies, and some to South Korean manufacturers. This became a symbol of a serious shift. Whereas Washington had previously been seen as the sole guarantor of security, its position began to erode even among its most dependent partners. Another alarming signal came from Scandinavia, where several countries announced the creation of a joint program to develop air defense systems, rejecting American counterparts. Formerly, the talk was about reducing costs and controlling their own technologies, but experts noted that the real reason was mistrust of the stability of the US as a supplier. Such steps were perceived as a demonstration Europe is ready to live without American support in the field of armaments. Thus, the crisis within the US defense industry and Europe's external reaction turned out to be links in the same chain. Internal problems, staff shortages, technological stagnation, logistical disruptions made products less competitive. Political unpredictability and trade wars reinforced mistrust. Europe, in turn, seized the moment to strengthen its own military-industrial complex and reduce its dependence on Washington.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Many analysts today say that it was this combination of factors that became the turning point. America lost its status as the sole supplier of weapons to its allies, and Europe got a chance to build an independent center of power. For the US, this means not only the loss of billions of dollars in contracts, but also the undermining of its strategic position. After all, weapons are not just technology, they are also an instrument of influence. When Europe and Canada begin to reject American supplies, it sends a signal to the whole world. Washington's role as a global guarantor of security is no longer uncontested. This is how internal crises in the US defense industry have combined with Europe's determination to go its own way, creating a new reality in which American hegemony in the arms sector is under threat for the first time. Canada has always been considered the United States' most reliable ally. Geographical proximity, common interests in defense, and close cooperation within NATO have made the relationship between the two countries a model of strategic partnership. But it is precisely here, where Washington counted on unconditional support, that an unexpected shift has taken place in recent years. The Canadian leadership has increasingly questioned the need to maintain the previous level of dependence on American arms supplies. For the US, this was a real blow because it was not just a matter of lost contracts, but the destruction of a symbol of eternal friendship that had been used for decades as an argument in international politics. Within Canada, there was a growing sentiment that the National Army should be armed primarily with domestically produced equipment or purchased from partners whose policies appear more predictable. There was growing public dissatisfaction with the fact that purchases from the US were not only expensive but also subject to political risks. Several high-profile delays in the delivery of American helicopters and drones became the trigger that sparked heated debates in Parliament. There were voices saying that Washington was no longer capable of fulfilling its role as a reliable and stable supplier. The Canadian press actively discussed how the American defense industry is losing its competitiveness, which means that dependence on it is becoming a weakness. Canada's refusal to sign a major contract for the purchase of American armored vehicles was particularly symbolic. The official reason given was high cost and technical problems, but the political subtext was obvious. For the first time in many decades, Ottawa made it clear that it was ready to turn to other markets. Among the alternatives discussed were European projects and proposals from South Korea. This was a painful signal for the US, as the loss of even one major partner could trigger a chain reaction. If its closest neighbor and ally shows distrust, what is to prevent other NATO countries from doing the same? Against this backdrop, broader consequences began to emerge. The economic damage to the American defense industry was significant. According to a number of research centers, in just 3 years, the US lost contracts worth tens of billions of dollars, which went to Europe and Asia. But financial losses were only part of the picture. The destruction of trust became much more dangerous. When allies refused to buy products, citing their instability and political unpredictability, it means that America is losing not only customers, but also strategic leverage. US global leadership in the arms industry has always been based on 3 pillars: technological superiority, economic scale, and political authority. Now, each of these elements is under threat. Technological backwardness has manifested itself in new projects being delayed or becoming obsolete before they even reach the market. Economic power has been shaken by the mass exodus of allies to competitors. Political authority has suffered from the unpredictability with which Donald Trump treated his partners at the time. All this has combined to create a systemic crisis, the echoes of which can still be heard today.